I married my husband exactly 1 week after my 19th birthday. Marcus was, as my stepfather Jedediah Bell had repeatedly told me, a good match for me. He was a member of the same congregation that my stepfather was pastor of. His most defining qualities was that he was near my age and unmarried. Jedediah made it very clear that as head of the household, he was perfectly capable of finding me a God-fearing husband. My stepfather had married my widowed mother when I was 14. He came into our life like a showman. Jedediah was larger than life in almost every way. Large stomach, large smile, and large beliefs about how wives and stepdaughters should treat the new man of the house. "Please, Greta, just make sure you do as he says. He means everything to me," my mother pleaded with me. The pain and desperation in her face was enough to convince me. Just to see her happy again was enough. At least, it had been. I had not interacted much with Marcus before our fast engagement and hasty church wedding on a sweltering day in May. He was always in khakis or faded blue jeans, complete with a button-down shirt every Sunday morning, sandwiched between his parents and siblings. I had known that he was a mechanic, and despite what I had assumed were frequent showers, the smell of machine oil always lingered. He never smiled. His eyes had always seemed cold to me, despite the warm shade of blue they contained. Shortly after we were married, he took a job as a mechanic at a shop that was an hour away from where we were currently living, which was in my old bedroom while we looked for a home. I was actually happy to be leaving my stepfather and mother behind. I loved my mother, but she had become a timid and quiet thing, not like the mother I remembered from when my father was still alive. As Jedediah would say with his wide-toothed smile, a wife had to do what was best for her husband, which meant obeying without question. My own job was simple. I was a receptionist at a dentist office, but I loved it there. I had no other education besides my high school diploma and started my job right after school. My co-workers were so kind. I cried as I turned in my 2 weeks' notice. They gave me a small farewell party, complete with cake and wine, and told me to keep in touch. The move was fast since I had very little to move to our new home. I could fit all of my clothes in a small and battered suitcase that was older than I was. The rest of my possessions fit into a cardboard box. I loaded up my car with my things and set out for what I hoped was a brighter future. I stopped only once to gather groceries, as I knew it would be up to me to make lunch and dinner that night. The home that we were renting was an old one. When I first laid eyes on it, my heart sank. I could already envision the old Formica counters and threadbare carpets. It looked like it was barely hanging together. Marcus was silent with me as we moved in our things, though he did make conversation with his brothers and relatives who had come to haul in the heavier furniture. I busied myself with unpacking the kitchen as quickly as I could so that I could start making lunch for everyone. I approached Marcus as he was carrying a box into the master bedroom. "What would you like to eat for lunch, sweetheart?" That term of endearment sounded so false on my tongue I nearly choked. He was my husband, not my sweetheart. Marcus paused long enough to give me a harsh glare. I withered under that gaze and looked down. "Just make some fried chicken, you're good at that, and mashed potatoes," he said gruffly as he turned away to store the box in the bedroom. I hurried to make the requested fried chicken and mashed potatoes. I was thankful that I had stopped at the grocery store to gather supplies. Fried chicken would be easy to make and fulfilling for the men as they fixed up the house. The lunch was ready just as the last cardboard box found its way into the house. I served everyone at the table while Marcus led us in prayer. My stepfather and mother were not present, as my stepfather did not like to travel, and my mother was rarely able to go anywhere without her husband. It was up to Marcus to say the blessings before we could begin to eat our meal. I had also misjudged how hungry everyone would be. The men devoured the chicken as fast as I set it on the table. By the time I was able to sit down and join everyone, there was only a small piece left. One of Marcus's brothers saw that I had nothing for myself and insisted I take the last piece of meat. I ate it happily, though I saw Marcus glaring at me out of the corner of my eye, and I wondered, with a jolt of fear, what I had done wrong. After everyone had left, I found out why Marcus had glared at me. While I was cleaning up the table, he grabbed my forearm roughly and squeezed it hard, digging in his nails, which were encrusted with dirt. I whimpered slightly but stopped myself from jerking away, as I knew it would only make it worse. He looked into my eyes and spoke in a low and angry voice. "Why didn't you make sure that you had enough food for everyone? You humiliated me. My brother shouldn't have to give up food so that you can stuff yourself. You did nothing all day while we all worked." I stuttered, biting back a retort, realizing it would not do any good. I'm so sorry, Marcus. This Sunday I'll make everyone lunch. I can make enough for everyone to make up for today." I grimaced as his grip on my arm increased, and I was sure his dirty nails were breaking the skin. With one last hard squeeze, he let me go and sat back in his chair. "I think that would make up for it, but make sure you ask proper forgiveness from my brother and everyone else that helped with today." I nodded numbly, not yet daring to move away from him. He gave me one last withering glare and set off to the garage, most likely to arrange his tools in the small space. After he was out of sight, I gingerly rubbed my forearm. A nasty bruise was already starting to form. There were little half-moon marks where his nails had dug into my arm. I wasn't sure how I would hide my bruises as I had a job interview tomorrow. It was for another receptionist job. It would not be much, but it would grant me at least some autonomy away from my husband. I wrapped my arm in a dish towel that I had dipped in cold water. After that, I took extra care to wash the dishes and make sure the kitchen was as clean as possible. I winced when I heard Marcus come in from the garage a few hours later. I was still straightening up the bedroom and putting clothes away when he came to bed. He didn't say anything to me, or even look at me. He turned on our bedroom TV and watched the local television until he fell asleep. It was only after he had fallen asleep that I felt safe enough to lay down next to him and fall asleep. I stayed there, as quiet as possible, while he snored beside me and waited for sleep to take me. The interview the next morning went incredibly well. I had opted to wear a long-sleeve silk blouse to cover my bruised arm. I was hired on the spot as they had been desperate for a new receptionist with previous experience. Plus, I had nothing but glowing reviews from my previous job. I was excited. This job gave me time away from home and my own money, plus benefits. I went home after the interview feeling optimistic. I would have called and told Marcus and my mother about the new job, but I didn't have a cell phone. My husband would hear about the job once he got home that night. For dinner, I made meatloaf and arranged the table as nicely as possible. There was still a knot of fear in my stomach as I lay out the food for our meal. If something was not to Marcus's liking, I didn't want to risk getting another bruise. He arrived just as I set the meatloaf on the table. I looked up at him as he entered and tried to force a smile. He didn't look at me, but headed straight to the kitchen to wash his hands of their persistent grease. After the blessing, he ate in silence, wolfing down his food and going in for seconds. I took the opportunity to try and start a conversation. "How was your job today?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light and pleasant. I was rewarded with a glare. "I don't want to talk while I'm eating," he said as he swallowed another bite. I nodded and looked down, not wanting to do anything to provoke him. After dinner, he went into the garage and stayed there until bedtime, never even bothering to say another word to me. I preferred it that way. While we lay down for bed, I finally told him that I had gotten the job. He rolled over and gave me what probably amounted to a pleased look. "It's good that you got the job. Make sure you deposit everything in the joint account. As the man of the house, I will make sure to give you an allowance to cover gas." And with that, he rolled over and went straight to sleep. I said nothing, but I let a few silent tears roll down my cheek in the dark. Any autonomy I had hoped to have would be gone now. I should just run away, I told myself in a brief spark of defiance. I could pack everything in my trunk and just drive as far as I could. But how far would I get with no money? My truck needed gas, and I would need food. There were no friends I could turn to, and my own mother was out of the question. I was alone. The next day was a Saturday, and Marcus was off work. Marcus pinched me awake at dawn to go make breakfast. I rushed to make it, anything to get away from those bruising pinches. Since it was a Saturday, I knew he might work on his own truck today or mow the lawn. It would give me time to myself to decorate the inside of the house. While I was making a list of groceries to get, while I was out later that day, I saw Marcus coming out of our room with a handful of my clothes. "Marcus, what are you doing with my clothes?" He stopped and looked at me, fixing on me with those cold eyes. "These shirts aren't decent. You should only be wearing long-sleeve shirts or dresses." He held up the few t-shirts that I actually owned. Some of them were plain cotton tees, others were nice ones that I wore to work when it was hot. "I'm going to turn these into rags. I could use some for my garage." He glared at me again, almost daring me to fight him. I shrunk back from his gaze. "But if you take those shirts, I won't have much to wear for work. I'll have to go buy some long-sleeved tops somewhere," I said pleadingly. I hated myself in that moment. I should have slapped him then, taken my things and run away. Money and marriage be damned. Sleeping on the street would be better than this. But I didn't move. I stayed glued to the spot, staring at the floor because I was too afraid to make eye contact with the man that I married. Marcus sighed and threw my clothes to the ground, pulled out his wallet and handed me a creased $20 bill. I took it with trembling fingers. "There's probably a Goodwill somewhere in this town. You can get yourself some clothes there and give me back the change." I nodded and stuffed the bill into my purse while he took my clothes into the garage. I left as soon as the door closed behind him, grabbing the grocery list as I went. I did not want to be around him while he destroyed my things. Once I was on the road, I started crying. I wiped my face angrily. Tears weren't going to be doing me any good. Instead, I set out trying to find a Goodwill or some other kind of thrift shop. It turned out my new town had none of these things, and I was starting to give up hope of finding any cheap clothing. I would have to settle for the local Target and hope for a sale. As I was thinking this, I saw on the side of the road a small yellow sign proudly proclaiming yard sale on 505 Turner Street. Someone had even tied a pink balloon to it to attract attention. I smiled. I'd forgotten about yard sales. It was a warm Saturday and there would probably be a ton of them. I might be able to find some clothes. I turned into the side street and it didn't take long for me to find the yard sale. It looked like a large one. There were 8 cars lined up on the side of the street and at least a dozen people were examining tables filled with second-hand goods. It had to have been one of the bigger yard sales I had seen. It looked like they were clearing out the entire house. I spotted what I had been hoping to find. Clothes were carefully arranged on a pole suspended between 2 trees. I parked my truck and walked over, happy to see the clothes were women's clothing. I browsed through the shirts and pants. I could tell they belonged to an older woman, but they were all in great shape, and some things still had tags on them. I settled on 5 new tops. They were all long-sleeved and looked conservative enough for both work and my husband's tastes. I tucked my finds under my arm and fished out the $20 Marcus had given me. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a box that had been placed under the clothes titled Miscellaneous, with a tiny doll poking out of it. It was entirely nondescript and devoid of features, like a rag doll. It had tiny red stitches for eyes and a mouth. The fabric looked like some kind of faded linen. I squished its belly, hoping to find out what it was stuffed with, and whatever its insides were composed of rolled around. Maybe it was filled with dried beans? The tiny doll looked at me in what I thought was an expression of curiosity, which was not possible as it hardly had any features at all. In some ways, it reminded me of Oogie Boogie from my favorite childhood film. I held on to the tiny doll. It wouldn't hurt to ask how much it was. The woman who was running the yard sale was sitting at a small table under the shade of large trees. She was dressed in a sleeveless bright pink top with white shorts, all of which complemented her dark-colored skin. When she looked up at me, she smiled warmly and gestured to what I was holding. "Is that all for you, honey?" she asked with a pleasant voice. I nodded and laid the shirts down on the table so she could count them. "That's going to be $10 for all the shirts, honey. Do you need a bag to carry them?" "Yes, thank you," I answered. I held up the tiny doll for her to see. "How much would you like for this little doll?" She reached for it, and I let her take it. She gave it a small squeeze and let out a tiny laugh. I remember this little thing. My mom bought it when we took a trip down to New Orleans about, 20 years ago. She always said she wanted an authentic voodoo doll. I looked at the doll in surprise. So this little doll, it's really a voodoo doll? I had never seen one in real life before. If Marcus found out that I had even touched it, he would be upset. She set it down with the clothes and gave it a thoughtful look. Oh yes, my mom was adamant that she get a real one. She didn't want any fake tourist souvenir. That was the last trip we all took together as a family. It wasn't long afterwards that my father passed away from a heart attack. She sighed and made a sweeping motion with her hand to encompass the yard sale. All of this is because my mom died last month. It's up to me to make sure everything gets sold off. I'm so sorry to hear that. I trailed off suddenly, not sure what else to say. Anything that anyone could say about the death of a loved one seemed hollow. She shook her head. It's all right, sweetie. Death is just a natural part of living, after all. She poked the doll one more time with finality. I'll sell it to you for $1, she said with a smile. I thought for a moment I would get in trouble if my husband found that doll. Of course, he might not even know what it was if he did find it. Buying it would be a risk, an act of defiance. I think that sounds just fine. I handed over the money and she handed me back my change and stuffed everything in the bag for me. I left the yard sale feeling accomplished. I'd gotten a good deal, even better than shopping at the thrift store. I would have bought more, but I was expected to be back in time to make lunch. I dug around in the bag and set my little doll on the dashboard. It almost felt like having a friend along for the ride. Once I finished the rest of my errands, I drove home, making sure to stuff the doll in my purse. I didn't want Marcus to know that I had spent money on something so frivolous. While I was putting the groceries away, Marcus came in from the garage. I noted with a stab of anger that he was wiping his greasy hands on one of my old shirts. Give me the change and show me what you bought. If it's not appropriate, I'm turning them into rags like I did the others. I pulled out the change from my billfold, which he stuffed into his wallet, while he waited for me to show him what I bought. Each shirt was laid out on the table for his inspection. I was certain that they would be all right, but I was still nervous. These are okay. You don't need to be showing any kind of skin anyway. Where did you buy them from? He asked, finally looking at me. A yard sale. I figured they would be cheaper. I answered him, daring to meet his eyes. Good. This should be enough for you for now. I don't want any wife of mine spending money on clothes that she doesn't need. Make some lunch now. I'm hungry. And with that, he walked back out to the garage. Gathering up the shirts, I placed them neatly in my closet. My wardrobe was looking very sparse. As for the doll, I stuffed him under my pillow. I knew I was risking Marcus finding it, but for some reason, I was comforted by its presence, and I wanted it close. The next few weeks passed in a kind of a blur. The only thing good was my new job. I was really enjoying it, and I was getting along really well with my co-workers. At home, things were getting progressively worse. What had started out with pinches and grabs were evolving into punches. The first time he ever hit my face was when I asked if I could have a cell phone. The force of the hit flung my head back and I hit the wall and I started to cry. While I was slumped against the wall, he punched me in the back, driving the breath from my body. I fell to the floor and stayed there until Marcus went into the garage. My face, though swollen, didn't bruise, so I didn't have to make up any excuses for my co-workers. The weekly gas allowance that Marcus had promised me was $5 a week. I had nothing from which to save, which made the idea of running away even harder. I was not allowed to buy my own lunch or go anywhere after work, even though several co-workers had invited me out. My only relief at home was my tiny doll. Once Marcus was done with his abuse, I'd hug it to my chest and cry. It was the only thing in the house that was truly mine. I thought of my father and how much I missed him. I also thought about how much I wished he'd lived and my mother had died. He would never have forced me to marry Marcus. He would never have let Jedediah into our lives. As the months wore on, I thought I was starting to go crazy. Perhaps the isolation and abuse was screwing with my brain. Every time I looked at the doll, it looked a little more like Marcus every day. Its tiny stitched eyes and mouth, so devoid of expression, now seemed to remind me of my husband's glare and perpetual scowl. It was on a Saturday in September that I received the worst beating I had gotten so far. I had been very tired that morning, and while Marcus had gone to meet some friends from our old town, I lay down to take a nap. I had been sleeping peacefully on the bed when suddenly I was thrown to the floor. I screamed as I opened my eyes and saw Marcus staring down at me. "Why are you sleeping on a Saturday? Don't you have eyes to see the house is a mess? What kind of wife can't even clean properly?" He lifted his booted foot and brought it down hard on my stomach. My breath left me in a painful oomph. I had no time to recover before he pulled his leg back and kicked me in the ribs once, twice, then 3 times. I was screaming and begging for him to stop. All it got me was a slap to the face. He knelt down beside me and held me by my hair, forcing me to look in his eyes. "If this house isn't clean and lunch on the table by the time I get back from the hardware store, I'll do even worse to you. Do you understand?" "Yes, Marcus, I understand," I stammered, holding his gaze until he let my hair go and my head hit the carpet with a thunk. I stayed on the ground until I heard the front door slam behind him. I felt my stomach and my ribs. Was anything broken or bruised? I couldn't tell. It hurt so bad I couldn't sit up, but I made myself crawl to the bathroom. When I was able to stand, I swallowed some aspirin and stared at myself in the mirror. My right eye and cheek was starting to swell and bruise. There was no way I would be able to hide these marks from my co-workers on Monday. My stomach burned as I went back into the bedroom. I took up my doll and sobbed into its fabric. Now more than ever, it reminded me of Marcus. His evil glare and twisted mouth were there, plainly on the doll's face. I felt a surge of anger and hatred for him. I had never in my life wanted anyone or anything to die as much as I wanted Marcus to die. From under the bed, I took out my sewing box and grabbed the largest needle I could find. With one last look at the doll, I stabbed the needle right through its left eye, piercing it completely. The doll fell to the ground and I left it there. I couldn't find the energy to pick it back up. My mind was made up. I could call my old office and see if anyone could let me stay with them for a while. They had always been kind to me. Surely one of them would help. I mentally chastised myself for not thinking of it earlier. Instead of cleaning like Marcus had wanted, I started packing my suitcase. I raided Marcus's bedside table for loose change and came up with a few crumpled bills and change that would give me enough gas to drive away. I made a place for my doll on top of my clothes. I pulled out the sewing needle, feeling guilty for stabbing it in its eye. Oddly enough, it looked like its old self again. All traces of Marcus's scowl were gone. There was a knock at the door and my heart jumped into my throat. It was Marcus, back to make good on his promise. But it couldn't be Marcus. If it was him, he would have just opened the door and walked in. To be safe, though, I hid my suitcase in the closet and ran to answer the door. It was not Marcus, but 2 police officers staring at me through the screen door. My heart was pounding. Maybe a neighbor had heard my screams and called the cops? Opening the door, I forced a smile. "Hello, officers. Can I help you?" The male officer took off his hat and gave me a sorrowful look. His partner, a woman, took one look at my bruised and swollen face and gave me a very knowing look. "Ma'am, I'm very sorry to tell you this, but your husband has been in an accident." The next few days were all a continual blur as I made arrangements for my husband's funeral. Marcus had died while driving his truck. The doctors told me after his autopsy that he had suffered from a massive brain aneurysm that had killed him instantly. His car had rolled off into a ditch, and the force of the impact had tossed his body through the windshield. The ambulance had arrived in minutes, but there was nothing anyone could have done. His parents and siblings were beyond any consolation, and my heart went out to them. Marcus might have been their kin, but they shared none of his temperament. They were nothing but kind to me, and I couldn't help but feel guilty for causing them any pain. At the funeral, I wore a new black dress with short sleeves, not caring whether anyone saw the bruises on my arm that had been Marcus's final parting gift. Jedediah took issue with it, though. He looked indifferently over my bruised arms. These things can happen in a marriage. He was a good husband to you, Greta. At least cover up so no one can talk ill of the dead. With the funeral over, I had freedom for the first time in my life. It was a liberating feeling to have my own place and my own money and to do as I pleased. I took perhaps too much pleasure in donating Marcus's possessions, but I felt completely purged when the last reminder of him was gone from the house. The only problem was my mother and Jedediah. They were pressuring me to come back and live with them, despite my assurances that I was doing okay and I was getting by with just my paycheck. My stepfather would call me on my new cell phone and lecture me about how an unmarried woman's place was at home. And he would talk about how much my mother missed me. His voice was sickeningly condescending as he talked to me like a child. I listened politely while he told his piece over the phone, all the while holding my doll to my chest. And you know what? It was starting to look a lot like Jedediah.